Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. This is MCEA's webinar, The Law on the Line, Minnesota Legal Experts on Democracy's Best Defense. I'm Kathryn Hoffman. I'm the CEO of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. In case you don't know, MCEA is a now 51-year-old organization. We're an environmental law nonprofit. We use law and science to protect Minnesota's natural resources, environment, and the health of its people. And so we work on major environmental issues in the state, including clean energy and climate, sulfide mining, pipelines. We are dedicated to protecting and enforcing our environmental laws. We are a nonprofit, as I mentioned. Half of our funding comes from individuals like you. So thanks for joining us today. And if you enjoy this webinar, please do make a gift. There's a link in the chat. Right now, nonprofits need your help more than ever. There are challenges to our funding. There's more work to do than we've ever had. And we are so grateful for your support. So for today's webinar, why are we doing this Law on the Line webinar? This administration is threatening the rule of law in a way that has really not happened in modern times in this country. They are pushing the boundaries of what a president can do through executive actions and through executive orders, defying Congress by cutting programs and spending that's already been approved by Congress, and increasingly bumping up against the courts as it targets individuals in what many are already calling a constitutional crisis. And so MCEA wanted to host this conversation to talk about what's happening, why it matters, and what we in Minnesota can do about it. I'm very excited to have three distinguished speakers with me here today. Unfortunately, Keith Ellison was not able to make it at the last minute due to a conflict, but we are honored to have Liz Kramer with us. Liz is the Minnesota Solicitor General. Jess Braverman is with us today, the legal director of Gender Justice, another preeminent legal organization. And our third guest is our own Leigh Currie, who is the chief legal officer of MCEA. And each of them are going to talk a little bit about their own background and expertise in this area. So here's what we're going to do today with our webinar. I'm going to be asking our panelists a few questions about the threats to the rule of law that's happening throughout the country right now, what role Minnesota and our own state law plays in all of this, and what we can do about it. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So if you do, as attendees, have questions and answers, please put them in the Q&A box. The chat's not available for that. Use the Q&A. And we will try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. All right, so let's start with our panelists here today. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, why you wanted to work as a lawyer, just so that the audience starts to get to know you a little bit. And Liz, I'm going to start with you today.
Great. Thanks, Kathryn. Thanks, everybody, for having me. Again, my name is Liz Kramer. I'm our state Solicitor General, which does mean that I work in the Attorney General's office. Sometimes people aren't sure about that. I have served in this role since AG Ellison started in his role, so since February of 2019. And in case you don't know what the Solicitor General does, I oversee all appeals that involve the state. So our state constitutional officers, our state agencies, and important criminal appeals. And I defend constitutional challenges against our state laws. So if somebody goes to court, for example, and says that our deepfake law is unconstitutional, I will lead the team in defending that. So that's big picture what the Solicitor General does. But why it's relevant for today is that I have been our lead on working with this coalition of multiple attorneys general across the country to defend the rule of law. We call it the Project for Federal Accountability. It is 23 different AG offices around the nation, and it started over a year ago, kind of planning and developing responses and strategies in thinking about what might happen in a second Trump administration. And then now, of course, responding to that every day. So I think that is enough for now. Kathryn, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thanks for that information, Liz. I actually didn't know a lot about that project, so we'll be curious to hear more about that. Next, I'm going to go to Jess with Gender Justice. Jess, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jess Braverman, and I'm the legal director at Gender Justice. Gender Justice is a nonprofit located in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we do a lot of stuff. We litigate, meaning we file lawsuits in court. We do advocacy in the Capitol and in communities at school board meetings, that sort of thing. And we do education. We educate judges, we educate the public on issues that are within our wheelhouse. We deal with all issues sex discrimination, and we really look at that topic broadly. So that includes the rights of pregnant and pumping employees, for example. That includes the right to abortion. That includes the right of trans youth in schools. And so we bring, as a legal director, I'm in charge of our litigation program, and we bring what's called impact litigation, meaning big cases that we want to have a big impact on a lot of people or on the law. We bring those cases in court. We focus a lot on state court. So we bring a lot of cases in Minnesota state court. Also, we bring cases in North Dakota. And so we're shoring up our courts and our state level protections. We can't really do anything about these appointed federal judges with lifetime appointments who are doing terrible things. But what we can do is shore up our state level protections and make sure we're protected as much as possible. And that's what we really focus on anything broadly to do with sex discrimination. So I've been a lawyer since 2009. I'm from New York City. I'm from the Bronx. And I wanted to work as a lawyer. I didn't even know what being a lawyer was, to be honest. Like my family's not from this country. My mom is a nurse. My dad makes dentures. None of them went to law school, and so I wasn't entirely sure what it was. And it was very intimidating to get into it, not having that family background. My colleagues at school, their parents were federal judges or partners at law firms, and so it was kind of intimidating. And so I like talking about the law. I like bringing the law to people who aren't lawyers and making that more accessible and making the whole thing less scary and mysterious, because I had to go through that process for myself. And so, yeah, so I do a lot of public education as well, on the law and that sort of thing.
All right, thanks, Jess, for that introduction. All right, let's go to Leigh Currie.
Yeah, thanks, Kathryn. So Kathryn already gave an explanation of Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. I'm the chief legal officer here, and in my role, I manage MCEA's legal team and our litigation, and then I work a few cases myself also. And I guess, I first knew that I wanted to do something in the realm of environmental protection pretty early on, like as an undergrad. But it took me a while to land on getting a law degree or wanting to pursue, a legal career. And similar to Jess, I did not know your background, but, didn't have any lawyers in my family, they're not from this country either. And it took me, so I kind of went to law school later in life. But I love the law now, and it was the right move for me because it fits my impatient personality. Under the law, you can kind of get an answer. You're not just like with policy and education, there's kind of a lag time of getting results. You're bargaining to try to get the best result you can. But usually in a legal case, you're making your best arguments, but then at the end of the day, there's like an answer one way or the other. And I really like that. And I love working for MCEA because it allows me to think creatively about, how can we use the judicial system in concert with, the other branches of government to move us forward in our mission of using law and science to protect Minnesotans and the natural resources. So it's been a great way to combine my environmental protection desire with the way my brain works and my law degree.
All right, thanks, Leigh. All right, so moving into some of the questions here, we're using this term rule of law, and I want I'm going to start with you, Liz. If you can talk a little bit about the rule of law in our democracy, what role it plays in terms of checks and balances or executive overreach. Like, what is the rule of law? What role does it play in our system?
Yeah, thanks, Kathryn. Rule of law is really just a shorthand way of describing all of the systems we have in place to make our checks and balances a reality. So it refers to our Constitution and our federal and state statutes. It refers to judge-made law, which is often called the common law. And it refers to norms, right? The way we have done things consistently in the past, all of which have been developed to support the system we have, which of course was in response to not wanting to have a king, one person making arbitrary rules and decisions. And so just a reminder, right? Our basic checks and balances, we have Congress, so elected representatives who make the law and critically appropriate money, because we were going to talk about that. Then we have the executive branch, the president and all the executive agencies who are there to enforce the law. And then we have our judges who are there to decide disputes. And often that involves interpreting law, but it also involves keeping the other branches of government in their lane. So rule of law really is a concept to describe all of that. And of course, one key that I haven't said yet is it means the rule of law applies to everyone. It applies to the president and it applies to rich people. So that's my very broad description for you.
Those seem like not random examples of who the rule of law might apply to. Thanks, Liz. All right, so super helpful background. Discussions about this administration's threats to the rule of law have been intensifying, and we're seeing them more in the mainstream media and in commentaries and in news stories. So let's talk about some of the ways that we're seeing this administration push against or ignore or violate the rule of law, if there are some particular examples that you're seeing in your work. And I'm going to start here with Jess.
Yeah, I really liked Solicitor General Kramer's explanation of what the rule of law is. I always struggle to define it for people because I'm too in my head about it, but I think like the system of checks and balances is a great way to put it. One really interesting thing, or at least I think it's interesting, is the Constitution, like Congress, the state house, the state Senate, they can't violate your constitutional rights, right? They can't pass laws that just trample over the rights that you're protected under the Constitution. But there's actually nothing stopping lawmakers from passing unconstitutional laws. They can pass a law today that says like, I'm gonna go to every Minnesotan hunter's house and take their guns. Like, right? Like they can pass a law today saying like Jewish people like me cannot go to synagogue. Are these laws constitutional? No. But can they pass a law like that? Yes, there's absolutely nothing stopping them from doing that. So then you have to go to court and get a judge to say like, come on, they can't enforce this law. And that's kind of an important context for what we see happening, which is there's two separate questions, right? There's like, can the president pass an executive order that says X, Y, and Z thing? And does that executive order mean anything? And those are two completely different questions. Yes, he can pass executive orders that say like, I'm renaming all of you Donalds. Like you all have that, like, is that something he can do by executive order? Like, no, but can he pass an executive order that says that? Yes. And what we're seeing is that he's passing executive orders that say all sorts of things he doesn't have the power to do, things that are illegal, things that are unconstitutional, things that just like can't happen, right? But because people don't know, even lawyers, right? People don't know which of his orders are actually something real that change anything and which are just like his wacky opinion. There's a lot of chaos and a lot of fear right now. And that's really what we're seeing happen. And that's why the rule of law, that's why I really like Solicitor General Kramer's definition of the rule of law, because it's not like what laws are passed and are they constitutional? It's those checks and balances. And so what we're seeing, for example, is he might pass an executive order saying, let's say, gender affirming care is hereby banned. Can the president ban gender affirming care? No. Right? He's not Congress. He can't pass a law. He's not a malpractice. He's not on the board of medicine. Right? He doesn't have that power. But if he passes that law saying, I'm going to pull funding from anyone who provides gender affirming medical care, people are saying, can he do that? I don't know. What should we do? And they're panicking and not providing the care. And what we call that is there's two things: pre-compliance and over-compliance. They comply with rules before they're even rules, and they comply more than they have to. And so the interesting thing that we're seeing with the rule of law, and I'm sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but it's such an interesting question to me. What we're seeing is that he is just saying whatever he wants, whether or not it has any effect, because regardless of whether it has any effect, it has an impact. And that's how he's really pushing at the boundaries of the rule of law. And so we're seeing a lot of that in the areas of trans rights. We're seeing rules about gender affirming medical care, press releases about VA coverage for trans people who have coverage through the VA. It's press release. It's not even an executive order, but it's impacting people's care. We're seeing kind of new avenues for a president to exert power, whether or not those avenues are real. And then there's the more obvious, there's the examples also that you're seeing in the media. I'm sure everyone on this call has seen of the president, let's say the administration deporting someone, and then when the court says like you can't do that, they say, oops, we already did, and that's what you're gonna see the most right now. But the rule of law is being challenged like at every step, like every day. With every executive order, we're seeing threats to the rule of law, and I would say it stems from there. It's not like, can he do it? It's what happens when he does it anyway. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a super helpful background. And this concept of pre-compliance and over-compliance, I think are really important ones when we think about the power of the executive branch. Leigh, let me go to you. Are you seeing examples within your practice of these attacks on the rule of law?
Yeah, so one thing about what this administration is doing with these executive orders is really not limiting it to one area or topic or crisis or emergency the way we sort of normally would think of those terms. It's been just a scattershot blanket of all sorts of issues. So yes, there's definitely been some aimed at environmental issues. One example, on his first day in office, January 20th, President Trump issued an executive order declaring a national energy emergency. So essentially saying that because of, I think the phrase in the order was something about the actions of the last administration, but it was code for work on climate change and trying to respond to the climate change crisis. And because of that, we are now falling short of energy sources, particularly fossil fuel sources, and he named critical minerals as another source of energy. And so he declared this emergency, which then is being used to take all sorts of actions in response. So just last week, in response to this so-called energy emergency, the Department of Interior issued new guidance around what should be done in terms of what's called environmental review. So when there's a big project like a mine or an oil pipeline, they have to go through a process where they have to look at what are the environmental effects of this project. It's usually called an environmental impact statement. And that can take some time if you do it right. It should take some time. There's a lot of angles and issues you need to look at. So often an environmental impact statement will take a year, maybe even more, to fully complete. Let the public engage. Public usually has comments and hearings. This new Department of Interior order, based in response to this emergency, says that everything has to be completed within 28 days. So, that would mean for the polymet mine that's proposed in Minnesota, which has been working its way through the process, or worked its way through the environmental review process over a number of years, would somehow have to fit within 28 days, which is pretty ridiculous. And I don't think is possible, but it shows sort of how he's trying to really fast track the types of energy that this administration wants to promote. The other thing I'll note is during the last term, only 23% of these types of actions that were challenged by states like Minnesota or other plaintiffs were successful. So a very low percentage of the actions last time actually survived judicial challenge. And so for those of us that were working during the last term and challenging some of these actions, that can be comforting to think, okay, well, he's doing all these things, but last time they didn't stand up in court. It's hard to have that same comfort, I think, this time when we're starting to see the administration ignore judges' orders and not respect the judiciary the way ostensibly they did in the last term. So there's a little bit more uncertainty, I would say, this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads nicely into my next question, which is that, we are seeing courts emerge again as one of the tools that we have, and probably the most effective at the moment, protecting our democracy. But also, we are seeing direct attacks on judicial independence. So we have people in Congress, Republicans in Congress, threatening to impeach judges who rule against the Trump administration. Most shockingly, I think there was this recent arrest last week of this district court judge in Milwaukee. So what are the risks here from these threats to judicial independence, and where might this be headed? Why don't I start with you, Liz?
It's such a dark place to start, Kathryn.
Sorry.
I do want to. So I have concerns about attacks on the judiciary and overall the judiciary's continued credibility with the American public, because in the end, that's what it all rests on. But I do want to highlight that in the vast majority of our cases, and when I say our, I mean this coalition of AGs, in particular, AG Ellison has already joined more than 19 cases against the federal government, and we are succeeding in every case. And the federal government is complying with the orders of our federal judges in every case, even when it's very challenging. So, for example, one of our early cases fought back against these big reductions in force in various federal agencies. And a federal judge said that the government had to immediately issue reinstatement, basically. Or let's just say, I don't remember what the thing they had to issue, but they had to reinstate like tens of thousands of workers within 24 hours, and they did it. So that's a hard thing that a judge made the government do, and they did it. So I just want to have a word of caution about like how broad this potential constitutional crisis is, because I do see it roughly limited to the immigration space. So I think our executive branch, our federal executive branch, has decided to take the position that they have more authority in the immigration space than they do in any other space. And that's where I think they're really pushing back against the judiciary. And so that fits the Wisconsin example. Of course, it fits the Maryland example of, Kilmar Abrego Garcia sent to El Salvador, and, now Trump admits that he could get him back. So that's the area where I really see this emerging conflict. In terms of like, where does this lead? Courts do have some tools at their disposal. They can prosecute the government and specific attorneys for contempt, and then there's some research going on, I think, about whether that is even a pardonable crime and whether it's pardonable at all levels. But overall, I do think that our courts still have a fair amount of credibility with the public, and that will bring pressure. I mean, I was shocked after what happened in Wisconsin, and I saw people just kind of sua sponte going and protesting and saying, like, stand up for our judges, stand up for our courts. And I don't know, that's something I wouldn't have imagined would have happened.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing from you, which is encouraging, is that you are not necessarily seeing judges responding with this sort of pre-compliance or over-compliance response that Jess was talking about. That's, the administration's trying to achieve in other areas. You're seeing, judges continuing to do their jobs as they should.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm wondering, Jess or Leigh, if you have anything else to add about these threats to the independence of the judiciary.
I have two things to add to it. One is like think about the lawsuits that are being filed and what it would look like if we didn't have an independent judiciary to hear these cases. So Trump by executive order says, I'm going to take away any federal grants that go to any facilities that provide gender affirming care to minors. We're talking about the Mayo Clinic. We're talking about, I believe, HCMC. We're talking about Children's Minnesota, like teaching hospitals, like that do, work on child cancer situations. So that's a really serious threat. Can he do it? Does it matter if he can do it, right? Is it enough to scare people anyway? And so there are 3 lawsuits in the country, including the one that the Attorney General's office of Minnesota signed on to, challenging that order. And because of those challenges, people are still able to get that life-saving care. If we didn't have an independent judiciary, if we didn't have these checks on the government, then that executive order, which I believe to be unlawful and not have any real effect, there'd be nothing stopping it, right? Because Trump said he's going to remove federal funding. Everyone says like, I have no recourse. There's nothing I can do if he does remove my federal funding. And so we'd be in a very, very bad situation if there were no judicial checks and balances. Where I think I have a little bit of where my nervousness comes from is kind of I've been saying this for years, even before Trump. In a lot of ways, the Supreme Court is kind of like Tinkerbell. Like if you don't believe in them, do they exist? Like what happens if none of us believe they have the power that they say they do? I'm not sure what the answer is to that, right? Like what can they do if the Supreme Court says to Trump, you cannot serve a 3rd term, and he says, I'm not leaving? Who are they? What are they? What happens then? And it's like I don't want to it's like I want to find out intellectually without anyone having to experience that. Like as someone who reads a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, I'm like, oh, then what? But I don't actually want anyone to have to live through that. But in my view, the Supreme Court, like the courts to some degree, right? Like there are things that can happen, but they require other actors. Like if I was a criminal defense attorney for a long time. If my client doesn't show up to court, a court can issue a warrant. But the judge doesn't go track down this guy, right? They have to have marshals or officers who are willing to look for this person and drag him to court. People who are willing, like, if they encounter him, to report him, right? So it takes a lot of actors to actually effectuate even a warrant, even a simple warrant where someone failed to show up to court. So like what happens when people don't want to do that job, when banks don't want to garnish people's money because they refuse to pay a judgment? Like what happens then? And so much when you think about it that way, so much of our system of checks and balances relies on people doing what they're supposed to do. And it's not clear to me what happens when at a really massive level they don't. But I think I'm getting a little like apocalyptic because I read too much. I don't see that like happening to that extreme. I just mentioned that because I think it's interesting and important to think about like the buck stops when people say it stops. So when are people going to say it stops, right? Like you need government actors. Like you need last time it wasn't all Mike Pence, right? But Mike Pence refused to sign anything saying, Trump was the president. Like having like even Trump's old AG, was it Bill Barr, who like I'm not saying I like him, but like he refused to go along with a lot of these really out there things. What happens if you don't have those people in place? What if you just have yes men? And I think that's what Trump's goal was. And so I think it's like a really interesting question. I don't think it'll really go there. But when we talk about checks and balances, it goes back to what Liz was saying earlier, where some of it is norms. And what if people don't follow those norms? What's the recourse? I don't know. And so it's a really interesting, it's kind of an existentialist question, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important way that, this administration is showing us what is a norm and what is, in fact, an enforceable boundary. And those are going to be treated differently. Leigh, do you have anything to add?
The only thing I was gonna say in response is I find some hope and comfort still in how the judiciary is responding. I mean, I think really what they're trying to uphold, even in the realm of immigration cases, which I really appreciate you pointing out that distinction, Liz, because that hadn't occurred to me, but it makes sense because a lot of what the administration is claiming is that these judges are trying to interfere with foreign policy. And that's why, you know, they're not going to comply. But really what the judiciary is doing is trying to uphold our principles of due process, you know, which basically just means you get a chance to say your piece in front of a decision maker before there's some action taken against you that you don't like. So you get a chance to sort of make your case. That's due process. And that right to due process is the foundation of our rule of law, of our government. You know, I appreciate the sort of what does the rule of law mean conversations. And in my head, it's the fact that we sort of adhere to documents and decisions rather than people and personalities, right? So we follow the Constitution and the statutes and court decisions, not necessarily a king or what one person says. And that's what the people who founded our country were trying to do. And a key component of that was giving regular people their chance to say their piece, their chance to have due process. And that's what the judges in a lot of these cases are trying to do, to just say, whoa, 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 you need to let people have a chance to at least come to court and say their piece before you can take this action. And so, you know, I disagree that it's an interference with foreign policy because I think it's really foundational to how our country works. But it makes me, I find comfort in the fact that they are upholding the sort of very fabric of our democracy by trying to make sure that these people have their day in court.
Yeah, well, and I'll note as well on the norms front that, you know, there was polling data from last week that many people may have seen that shows that Americans overwhelmingly believe that due process is important, and they overwhelmingly believe that the president should do what the Supreme Court says. So there is still a lot of faith in those that rule of law and those norms. Which is not in of itself enough to enforce the norms, but is certainly helpful and encouraging. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what's happening at the state level, or more directly, what we can do at the state level. Are there ways that we can use our state laws to step up and protect the things that we care about, even as the federal government may be rolling back some of those core protections? Maybe I'll start here with Leigh.
Yeah, so I feel very lucky right now to live in a state like Minnesota and to have an attorney general like Keith Ellison, where we do have a lot of protection for our rights through those state laws, and a attorney general who's willing to, you know, enforce those rights through our state laws. So, you know, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we have it pretty good here in Minnesota. In terms of sort of how we at MCEA are going to try to continue to use our state laws, you know, we want to leverage those good state laws to continue to make progress on our mission of, you know, clean air, clean water, safe environment for everybody. And we don't want to just hold the line. Like, I think it's tempting to just want to fight back against these bad ideas and claim victory if you know, we can shut them down. But then we're just you know, we're kind of just staying at the status quo when a lot of these issues like climate change and water pollution are steadily getting worse. And so really we're not we're losing ground if that's all we do. And so at MCEA, we want to continue to push the needle on a lot of these issues through state level advocacy, even during this time when or not even, I would say, especially during this time when it's being eroded at the federal level.
Thanks. I'll go to Jess next.
Yeah, state level protections are crucial, and the work that state level organizations do are also really critical. And I'll just give two really concrete examples here. One is Gender Justice sued over Minnesota's abortion restrictions, and we got those restrictions, they were found unconstitutional. That decision came down 2 weeks after Dobbs, meaning, which was the Supreme Court saying abortion is no longer protected under federal law. I want to talk about what that looks like for Minnesota to have state level protections at that moment in time. North and South Dakota had trigger laws, meaning they had laws that went into effect immediately once Roe v. Wade is overturned, banning abortion in North and South Dakota. So there was no abortion in those states. Iowa had state level protections, but the Supreme Court quite literally said, never mind, and got rid of them a few years before Dobbs. So Iowa had no protections and Iowa had no abortion care. Wisconsin also had a ban from before Roe v. Wade that people were worried would go back into effect, meaning that ban was never repealed. It was still on the books, and people providing care didn't know, am I going to be arrested under this old law if I do? Wisconsin had no abortion care. So Minnesota's in the center of North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, all of which had no abortion care. We were able to provide care to Minnesotans and to people in all those states and to people all around the country because, and only because, we had state level protections. So that really matters. And that's a really concrete example from recent history that I can give. Another really concrete example I'd like to give involves trans kids in schools. Gender Justice has been litigating for a long time under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which is our state level anti-discrimination law, that it protects trans people, it protects them to a really strong degree. And we've been fighting for those rights for over a decade and successfully. The Trump administration is now arguing that Title IX, which is a federal discrimination law in schools, forces schools to discriminate against trans kids. He's wrong. I'll say that. Like, he's wrong. The law does not force schools to discriminate. If anything, it protects transgender kids. But he's telling schools that if you don't discriminate against trans kids, I'm going to pull your federal funding under this Title IX law. Because we have strong protections in Minnesota, the Attorney General's office was able to say, stop threatening us. We're going to sue you. You need to leave us alone because our state laws protect trans people. And if you don't have those state level protections, you don't have anything to fight about. There was a great interest in question in the chat. What happens, like, are federal laws supreme? Like, if federal law trumps state law. Federal law only trumps state law if, first of all, the federal law is like constitutional and procedurally proper. But assuming that, it trumps state law if there's a conflict between the two. But we get to say Minnesota protects trans kids. Federal law also does, but even if you think it has nothing to say about trans kids, there's no conflict. Like, Minnesota says protect trans kids and federal law says nothing. Either way, we're going to protect trans kids in Minnesota and you've got to leave us alone. And so those state level protections allow us to actually stand up to the Trump administration and say, stop bullying us, stop trying to force us to bully our kids. We have these protections and we have the right as a state to do that. And thankfully, we have a proactive Attorney General's office who's actually involving itself in a lot of important litigation, including that one, telling them to back off, like, we have state level rights and you're interfering. And so having these state level groups doing state level work like Gender Justice and MCEA and other organizations, the work is really crucial because not everything that happens at the federal level is like a ban on states' rights necessarily. Like, affirmative state level protections can really kick in really crucial ways. And those are just two examples of like the most salient ones from, going on right now that I can cite to.
Thanks. Those are great examples, Jess. Appreciate it. And so, Liz, I'm sure this question of Minnesota law being able to govern how Minnesotans live and work and what rights we have every day is also central to your work right now. You want to say a little bit more about protecting and the use of state law?
Yeah, thanks, Kathryn. I want to build off what Jess said, because she's absolutely right. So our Minnesota Constitution and our Minnesota statutes are generally more protective of people's rights than the federal Constitution and federal laws, and particularly in what we might call the civil rights, arena. And so, for example, Minnesota law has great protections for undocumented people, for transgender people, for generally queer people, non-binary people, and still supports, to the extent it can under the federal Constitution, diversity efforts, inclusion efforts. So all of these are things that are still absolutely valid and in effect in state law. And I want to go back to what Jess said kind of in the beginning, which is about the chaos and the pre-compliance and over-compliance. Part of what has happened is you have these executive orders that I consider like puffery, right? Just like a statement of opinion from the president. But most people don't know that. And so it creates real confusion about where does that leave state law, because the president just said something different. So one thing, in addition to, bringing 19 cases against the president, which I appreciate that Mayor put in the chat a link to an article that just helps people go through those. The AG's office has been issuing opinions, which are generally binding or persuasive statements about Minnesota law in areas where there appears to be confusion between what's happening at the federal level and kind of the statements coming out of the president's mouth and its interaction with Minnesota law. So I'll say that's been a key piece of how we're trying to help remind people that Minnesota law is still valid and can still be enforced. The other thing I'll say is that hasn't come up yet is one aspect of the federal government that has really been attacked is protections for consumers and protection for union members, but in particular, things like the FTC and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau have been just decimated by President Trump. And so one additional way that the AG's office is helping to step into the void is to do more consumer work. And instead of stepping back, to really step forward and say, all right, if there's fewer enforcers at the federal level of these important consumer protections, then state AG enforcers need to do more of that work.
Yeah, that's much appreciated, Liz. The Minnesota Attorney General's office work on consumer protection is, I think, quite outstanding among states. So, and I mean, your point about sort of mere puffery, is a good one. I actually had a reporter ask me this morning about this guidance that Leigh mentioned, where we're going to do EISs in 28 days now, even though they usually take, a year is a good sort of minimum. And sometimes they can be done a year, but it often takes many years for big, complicated projects. And this, reporter said, well, is this just talk? Can we ignore it? And yeah, on one level it's talk, but on another level, if we don't have any federal government employees to oversee these EIS processes, and if we don't have, in states particularly where they don't have a separate environmental review process, you could definitely see this becoming a real issue. And if nothing else, putting a ton of pressure on federal agencies to do very insufficient and rapid environmental review processes. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of questions in the Q&A about, what can we do, which I think is a really good question. So I'd love to hear from our panelists about what steps can the folks in the audience and here in attendance take to help. And do you have asks of the people who are logged on today? I'm going to start with Leigh.
All right, couldn't find my mute for a second there. Thanks, Kathryn. Yeah, so I think in terms of what people can do, just not taking everything at face value, I think is step one in terms of this sort of pre-compliance, over-compliance, believing everything that comes, every executive order that comes out is enforceable. I think everyone can take these actions with a grain of salt and encourage others to do so that we're not changing our behaviors and our actions in a negative way when we shouldn't be, when we don't need to be. Knowing your rights and in combination with understanding your own privileges, I think is really important. So, you know, I'm an immigrant, but I'm privileged enough to be white and English speaking, and I'm not a target of this administration. You know, but how can I use my position of privilege to speak up for others' rights? You know, how can people in this audience use whatever privilege you may have, where you're potentially not a target of this administration, to help those who may be? And I think if we can all think that way, it will help the people who really are feeling the brunt of this administration's ire. So that would be my, you know, my recommendation. Don't take everything at face value, understand your rights, and speak up for others.
Thanks, Leigh. How about you, Jess? What would you recommend?
I'm off of social media, highly recommend. Like, I'm just done with it and it's fantastic. So I would say I'm living my best life now, and you can too. If you go to genderjustice.us and sign up for our listserv, we have we send out action items, like we send out events, we send out times to write to your lawmakers, and I probably don't have to say this to this particular room. However, I didn't realize how much our lawmakers actually care that they hear from us. Like, I used to think like, oh, they get so many letters, whatever, they're not going to care. Like, it turns out now that I've met a bunch that they do. They read the letters. Some of them, there might be a bill, and some of them will tell me they've only gotten like 3 emails about it, right? So like, your emails reaching out to lawmakers can actually make a huge difference. And so we do send out opportunities for that. We have trans equity training. If you're like, Jess talked a lot about trans rights, but I don't know what that is, like, come join one of our trainings and learn more about it. I think that's a fantastic way to get involved. And the big thing that I basically tell everyone is like not to fall for there's lots of efforts to divide us, right? Like good immigrants or bad immigrants, documented immigrants or undocumented immigrants, trans girls who want to play sports, right? Like there's all of these ways that people try to, and some are really effective. Like the trans girls in sports one, it's a really effective canard. And I say this as someone like, a huge chunk of my life is advocating in sports. I have yet to see a study that calls for banning trans girls from girls' sport. Like, I have not seen any data to back up these bans. And I say this as someone who loves women's sports. I'm a Lynx member, but it's such an effective talking point that it gets people to go so far as to advocate for things that undermine their own rights. So we're seeing the Trump administration take away protections for sexual harassment among athletes, and the people supporting Trump in schools and student athletes are, it's feminist. It's the wildest thing, right? Like people are falling for it. Question everything. Like if the media is pushing this narrative of like good immigrant versus bad immigrant, question it. Ask questions. If they're pushing this whole like women, like trans girls are a threat to girls' sports, like how many trans athletes are there in the state of Minnesota? And has it had any impact on girls' sports? If anything, I would say it's a positive impact. We leave the country in girls' sports and we're inclusive, right? So ask questions. I would say that's a big one, and don't just fall for the divisive rhetoric, because they're trying to tear all of us apart. So yeah, just question it when you hear it.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Double click on the social media recommendation. By the way, I'm with you. Liz, how about you? What would you recommend?
I mostly had to get off Twitter. I refuse to call it X because I sign all these complaints against the federal government, and so that means my particular name was out there for attack. I'll say this is a time for showing up. So I would say most of my adult life, I've been a lawyer since 2002, so that gives you a sense of my age. Most of my adult life, like there was no need to protest. And sometimes I felt a little jealous of my parents who were 60s people and had like gotten out there against the Vietnam War and, you know, in favor of civil rights laws. We're in that moment. And Jess said that legislators care about the calls you make to them and the letters you make to them. They also care about how many people show up and demonstrate by their physical presence that something is important to them. So I know we can't all do it like every day or every weekend, but when you see, a big effort to bring people together, I would say show up. I hope you will show up when judges are attacked. I hope you will show up when lawyers are attacked. A.G. Ellison is being threatened with criminal prosecution because he refuses to roll over on the issue of transports. So, that day could come where Pam Bondi comes to criminally threaten or sue A.J. Ellison. The other thing I'll say, just kind of big picture, is we all need to re-engage in civics education. Too many of our neighbors don't know kind of about checks and balances and don't feel confident about what the lane is for each part of government. And let's make sure that all the young people in our lives get that education. And then also think about which of these norms need to be turned into actual statutes. So I'm just going to call out one example. It used to be a norm that our federal attorney general's office was apolitical and was supposed to be independent. And they had a lot of internal memorandum and policy about that. But that was just thrown out the window in this administration. And I don't know how we bring it back. But if that's something that bothers you, that could be turned into like a federal statute. This is something that we could bring back and have it be more enforceable than just a common expectation or norm.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, and we've touched on a lot of the topics, but one question is sort of let's look into the future and see where this is going. And I want you to look a little further into the future in light of what Liz is saying, and think about what would be the good outcomes here in terms of maybe if people show up. And if Congress plays the role that Congress should be playing, what would you want to see in terms of norms and guardrails moving into the future? And not just norms, but more specific guardrails. What improvements can we make? What lessons can we learn from this situation? Maybe I'll start with Jess on this one.
That's such a hard question. Like what norms and guardrails? I think the main thing for me is I'd really like to see courts take a stronger stand when lawmakers are really ideologically motivated, because they get involved in people's healthcare, they get involved in people's private lives to this really, really dangerous degree without knowing what it is they're legislating about. And that to me is terrifying because people are being denied healthcare over it. So let's say we take like gender affirming medical care. There's guidelines, there's standards, there's every single medical association in the United States, like every major medical association in the United States supports this care. But you wouldn't know it because of the way the lawmakers are attacking it, the way the media is attacking it. I really wish there was that there are mechanisms for courts to look into whether laws were passed based on like animus, meaning like dislike towards a certain group, as opposed to real legitimate like issues. And we see this in the immigration context. For example, Sonia Sotomayor wrote this great dissent where she's like, we can't let this law stand. It's like she cited to Trump tweets and was like, look at this animus. Like he passed this based on animus. We see it in LGBT rights. We've seen courts do this. In my view, they don't do it enough, and I think they should. And so I really wish courts stepped in more and had a stronger hand and weren't shying away from like, oh, we need to let lawmakers do what they do, because what they're doing is often really dangerous. And so I would like to see, it's rare that I say I want more court involvement, but this is one area where I'd actually like to see courts stand up, and it would be so effective now during this administration because like every tweet is animus. And so like, is he doing this because of animus? Like, then I'm not going to let it go. And some of the lawsuits, including, I believe the one the attorney general is involved in, courts did say that. They said this gender affirming care ban, like, look at there's no reasonable reason to do this. There's no explanation for why this was so urgent other than animus. And so I would like to see courts step in more when that's just so clear.
Yeah, thank you. Liz, how about you? What would be a good outcome of all these threats?
Hopefully that we all stop taking for granted our system. I mean, like maybe that sounds Pollyannish, but we had a good run going where we didn't have to think that much about these things, and kind of having a moment where we're confronted with autocracy, I think has forced people to say, oh, wait, like, what did I appreciate about what was happening, and how can I get it back? I do think one thing we haven't talked about so far is that Congress has been really ineffective for a long time, and it's partly the US Congress's inability or unwillingness to actually pass legislation that has created this void where public kind of felt like Washington wasn't doing anything, which allowed people to support the idea that Trump would just come in and do things. And that so fixing that balance a little bit, and trying to look at, like, why is Congress so ineffective, and what might we do to release some of those obstacles. But also we need some decisions on some of the things the Trump team is raising. I mean, some of the legal underpinnings of what they're doing have been Federalist Society projects for decades. And until we get an answer that says this is not valid, like this unitary executive theory or some of these other things are just not valid, it's going to keep coming up. So that's another like legal positive that I hope we get out of this.
Yeah, thanks. Good point. All right, Leigh, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking and hoping that at some point people will have had enough and the pendulum will swing, and there will be something that galvanizes people against more of these actions. And and in concert with that, and part of why we wanted to have this diverse panel today of different perspectives is really understanding that intersectionality of people's rights. So, gender rights and environmental rights and right to education, and all of these are connected in the sense that we need to stick up for how our government protects individual rights and environmental rights, and one affects the other. And so that could be a really positive thing coming out of this, is sort of a galvanizing of, all right, this is too far. We're sticking up for our rights, and the pendulum is going to swing back to, where we're really protecting the things we care about.
Absolutely. And I think that really leads back to the main lesson to me as well, which is one person's rights is everybody's rights. And that's why it's important that we all show up right now, is if you're seeing other people's rights being violated, that's not about them. That's about you too. And it's about the democracy that we want and the rule of law that we want. So keep showing up. Thanks all for being here today. Really appreciate all our attendees. We're going to wrap up here, and particularly appreciate, thank you so much, Jess and Liz and Leigh, for being here today. Please, again, do support your legal organizations, make a gift to gender justice, make a gift to MCEA. Your support really matters. And thank you again. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.